Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leslie Orloff. I direct the National NUAP at American University, Washington College of Law, and we co-run with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, the National Judicial Network that's sponsoring this event today. The National Judicial Network is a forum on human trafficking and immigration in state courts, and this effort is being supported with a grant from the State Justice Institute. And the opinions you're going to be hearing today are those of the presenters, and the points of view do not necessarily represent the position of the State Justice Institute. Next slide, please. We want to start off by encouraging those of you who are on this call, who are judicial officers, or work with judges in your communities with victims of human trafficking to join the National Judicial Network. The National Judicial Network is made up of state court judges, magistrates, judicial officials, and some judicial education professionals who are committed to effective adjudication of cases involving immigration issues and human trafficking victims, and really is trying to focus on, it's an opportunity for judges on a monthly basis to meet and learn from each other about best practices for working with immigrant crime victims, immigrant children, and human trafficking victims, both immigrant and non-immigrant, in state courts. Next slide, please. So this webinar will be, those of you that are judges will receive a link to sign up for the Judicial Network following this webinar. Everybody on the call or that's registered will receive a link which is already up to the webpage that will contain the recording for this and contains the materials that we're distributing associated with this training. And I want to remind you, at the end, we're going to be doing a quick survey to get an evaluation, and we invite you to all join us in evaluating the webinar today. And the recording will be up shortly after this. Next slide, please. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to turn this presentation over to Judge Sarita, who will be leading the discussion today. And thank you, and to the other presenters who will be joining us. So thank you very much, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank Professor Orloff for all of her incredible efforts on behalf of the National Judicial Network, of which I am a steering committee member. So I am giving a shout out to them. And I hope you will consider joining this really wonderful organization. So today's presentation is called Criminal Justice Responses to Asian Women Caught in the Crosshairs of Exploitation and Human Trafficking. Today we'll be hearing from some speakers about what it means to deal with Asian trafficking survivors and others when providing culturally sensitive services for this population in the New York Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. My name is Toko Sarita, and I preside over what are known as problem-solving courts in Queens Criminal Court in New York City, a drug court, mental health court, and the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. That court was established to address the unjust treatment of individuals arrested on prostitution-related charges who were exploited in the commercial sex trade or were victims of human trafficking. The court in Queens was established in 2004 by Judge Fernando Camacho to provide services rather than jail time for trafficked youth, and then expanded in 2008 when I took over the court. At the time, most people didn't consider young American prostitutes as domestic victims of trafficking, and the court's treatment of Black women and girls mirrored the racism and sexism they continue to face in society. This court was an attempt to change that view, to identify and support trafficking survivors in whatever way we could, and in so doing, change the perception of sex workers who have been stigmatized and punished in the criminal justice system and elsewhere. As a woman of color, well aware of the intersections of race, gender, and class, and how it weighed upon the bodies of the women we saw, I felt it was our obligation to remedy this injustice. If nothing else, I believed we have helped to transform the culture of the courts by our treatment of these women as survivors and victims instead of as criminal offenders, and created more awareness about human trafficking. This is evidenced by the significant changes that have occurred in the years since. In 2013, my advocacy efforts outlining the need to develop a coordinated response to trafficking victims in the criminal justice system were realized by the creation of 8 new courts throughout the state, modeled after the Queen's Court. We now have similar courts in Rochester, Buffalo, Nassau County, Utica, Suffolk, and the 5 boroughs of New York City, each with its own unique identity to address the local needs of this population. With all the combined courts, we have adjudicated more than 16,000 cases, over 12,000 from New York City alone. Additionally, we now have DA's offices with human trafficking bureaus that take a victim-centered approach, defense attorneys specializing in trafficking cases, and a wide array of treatment specialists in the field, as well as improved societal responses to this issue and continuing changes in the law. The court's central purpose is to assist trafficking victims by providing them with a variety of services as an alternative to incarceration and to resolve these cases with non-criminal dispositions wherever possible. Faced with the unfortunate reality that most of the defendants arrested on prostitution-related charges are in fact victims of the commercial sex trade, the court seeks to assist trafficking victims and those at high risk of trafficking by connecting them to vital services such as housing, counseling, medical attention, and mental health and substance use treatment. These services are made available to everyone across the board, regardless of whether they are identified or self-identified as victims of trafficking. Recognizing the complexity of the trafficking situations many of these women are in, our goal is not to rescue women from trafficking, a laudable but impossible task, but to restore some dignity and agency in their lives and to promote their empowerment and well-being. A key feature of this court is a collaborative multidisciplinary team that works in a non-adversarial setting to provide trauma-informed services for this vulnerable population. This team includes social workers, court staff, along with dedicated prosecutors and defense attorneys who understand the dynamics of trafficking. More so than in any other problem-solving court, I've always emphasized the importance of the social workers and counselors who do the hard work of making connections with their clients and serving their needs. From the earliest time, we wanted our service providers in court on a weekly basis to provide the needed support for these defendants. Key members of this team include the social workers and counselors from various non-governmental organizations, without whom we would not be able to provide meaningful intervention and assistance. Most of the defendants in the HTIC are women of color and transgender women, primarily African-American, East Asian, and Latina. Because the circumstances of their trafficking situation may differ for each group, we have partnered with various organizations that can address those particular needs and provide the appropriate services. The Queen's Human Trafficking Intervention Court works collaboratively with 9 primary service providers who are assigned to each individual based on their specific needs and demographics, including referral to culturally and linguistically responsive organizations. This is broken down by age, sexual orientation, language, etc. For example, we have referred transgender defendants to Community Healthcare Network, where they may receive medical and health-related services in addition to counseling, or younger domestic trafficking survivors to Girls Educational Mentoring Services, otherwise known as GEMS. For those individuals in need of a higher level of substance use or mental health intervention, I may transfer their cases to my drug or mental health courts. For those with acute or chronic trauma in need of immediate attention, to the Hidden Victims Project. It wasn't until 2013 or so that we started seeing a spike in cases involving Asian women who were arrested for prostitution or practicing massage without a license. There were consistent and widespread arrests of these women working in massage parlors, such that by 2017, approximately 40% of the defendant population in our courts were East Asian women, mostly Chinese and sometimes Korean or Korean Chinese. The need to find culturally competent services for this growing population led to our outreach efforts and the development of partnerships with several community-based organizations that were interested in assisting Asian trafficking survivors. They had the necessary language skills and culturally grounded backgrounds to assist these women and were willing to collaborate with the court to provide invaluable services for trafficking survivors. These groups included Womankind, Restore New York, Garden of Hope, Korean American Family Services, and Sanctuary for Families. Throughout my experience working with trafficking survivors in this court, the service providers are the linchpin because whatever successful outcomes are achieved, we would be able to do little without their intervention. Virtually all of the Asian foreign nationals we saw in court had similar backgrounds. A typical scenario would involve women who came to the US from China, borrowing several $1,000s in order to seek a better life in the US. They would usually go through a visa agency with promises of legitimate work, only to be steered to a massage parlor and then being forced, coerced, or deceived into providing commercial sex. These women were usually middle-aged, often with children back home, in debt bondage, and suffering from multiple vulnerabilities, including being undocumented, speaking no English, having no understanding of American culture or laws, and being completely isolated. Many of them were often transported to other states and have been found all over New York, as well as in Texas, California, and Florida. One typical story involving a defendant from the Human Trafficking Intervention Court is the following. AL borrowed large amounts of money to travel to the US and find work, then grew desperate after she was unable to find employment. AL was lured by her trafficker into working alone at a shop where she was falsely assured she would only be giving massages. Her trafficker watched AL using hidden cameras and continually harassed AL to offer customers sexual services for money. He told her that she would not be able to find work elsewhere. Worn down, she finally obeyed her trafficker. Identifying Asian women for trafficking is incredibly difficult because of the multiple barriers that are present, including the underground nature of the criminal enterprise, the isolation of these non-English speaking women, the shame and stigma attached to commercial sex, and their extreme poverty. Here, in cases of massage parlor trafficking, there is usually very little physical violence, and the coercion and threats, coupled with cultural manipulation by the trafficker, may be very nuanced and subtle to the untrained eye. Massage parlor workers are all exploited for their labor, and there's pervasive labor trafficking taking place, but it may be harder to pinpoint instances of sex trafficking because of their complicated situations. One initiative that is worth mentioning and will be referred to in more detail was a human trafficking intervention pro bono project that Sanctuary oversaw in both Brooklyn and Queens. This was a project between the court, Sanctuary for Families, and several of the top law firms in New York City to provide free immigration representation for identified trafficking victims through the trafficking intervention courts. The Brooklyn group with Amy Shea was a part of immigration consultations that were conducted and trafficking screenings with Asian defendants. It was composed of a small cadre of Mandarin-speaking counselors and lawyers whose knowledge of the language as well as cultural proficiency worked wonders in gaining their clients' trust and had them willing to disclose their trafficking. Similarly, Yvonne Chen, also at Sanctuary at the time, was a regular and weekly presence in my court, as their job would be to approach Asian defendants to set up interviews for immigration screenings. We had decided that the typical 5 sessions of a recommended program would entail an additional immigration consultation to determine whether the defendants were entitled to immigration relief as a result of being trafficked. The interviews conducted by counselors and lawyers were very labor-intensive and thorough, and conducted by Mandarin-speaking counselors or lawyers who were aware of the trauma, shame, and stigma and fear that many of these women were experiencing. I mention both examples because I was deeply impressed by the ability of these advocates to get results, knowing how difficult and impenetrable were the walls that separated these women from the rest of society. Out of the 250 defendants that were interviewed as part of this project, Approximately 25% were found to have been trafficked, with about 75% exhibiting red flags for trafficking vulnerability. Once identified as trafficking survivors, the lawyers filed T-visa applications on their behalf and also provided them with wraparound services. So now let me introduce our two speakers today. Amy Shea is an attorney and independent consultant with expertise in anti-trafficking, immigration remedies for survivors, health, and human rights. She was formerly the deputy director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, where her work focuses on the legal needs of survivors of human trafficking, excuse me. Ms. Shea worked with clients to obtain immigration status, such as T non-immigrant status, to report crimes committed against them to law enforcement, and to obtain other legal remedies as needed. She helped to establish and oversaw the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Intervention Pro Bono project, where law students and pro bono attorneys were trained and conducted immigration consultations and trafficking screenings for clients referred by the Brooklyn HTIC. Now, as Director of Private Sector Engagement for ECPAT USA, Yvonne Chen ensures businesses and relevant stakeholders understand how human traffickers and child exploiters use business structures to exploit victims and identify, develop, and/or deploy tools and best practices to stop it. Ms. Chen brings a unique perspective, having been a living coordinator for a residential program for those who have experienced sex trafficking. She is a fluent Mandarin speaker and national expert on working with East Asian communities, trafficking, and massage businesses. She also has expertise in survivor engagement, victim identification, and outreach and training. Ms. Chen has a decade of experience providing direct services to trafficked persons. She has also trained and educated tens of thousands of community members and professionals to understand human trafficking and identify trafficked people. Prior to coming to ECPAT USA, Ms. Chen worked as a supervising program manager at another anti-trafficking agency and has experience working with different refugee populations in the United States and South Africa. So here is Ms. Chen and Ms. Che.
Thanks so much, Judge Sarita. And I think Elle's going to help us put up the slides for our presentation. Thank you so much. And we can just move on to the next slide. So as Judge Sarita talked about, and also I think in the description of today's webinar, we're going to cover quite a few different topics, and hopefully it will sink in somehow in the time that we're spending together. So we're going to talk a lot about the vulnerabilities that lead to coercion, exploitation, and trafficking for this particular population. We're going to talk about how cultural values might impact client contact, case management, counseling, intervention methods, and immigration challenges. We'll also talk about what are some promising practices to deliver trauma-informed and culturally appropriate case management and legal services, and why this should be considered social justice, racial and gender equity work. Next slide, please. So before we get into our discussion around vulnerabilities and why that's relevant, we just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page about what we mean by trafficking and exploitation. And so here we copied here a section of the Palermo Protocol, which includes an international definition of trafficking in persons. And this is a broader definition of trafficking. Here, I'm just going to highlight some portions of the definition. It highlights the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. And another piece that I also wanted to point out in this broader definition of trafficking is specifically that consent of a victim of trafficking in persons shall be irrelevant. And I think this is important to keep in mind as we talk about the population that we've encountered through the HTIC. Next slide, please. we've shared here the federal definition of trafficking, just because we're in the US context and it's helpful to have a sense of what that means, what we mean by it in the US. It's a slightly narrower definition than the Palermo Protocol in that it has a specific focus on the means of trafficking, which is force, fraud, and coercion. And here in A and B, subsection A and B of severe forms of trafficking persons, we see that force, fraud, or coercion are used for the purposes of sex trafficking or for the purposes of labor. And I also just include the definition of sex trafficking here, which is ultimately for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And finally, we wanted to highlight what the federal definition is for coercion, because it specifies the kinds of acts that are considered to be coercion, and then what can then render someone a survivor of severe form of trafficking in persons. And importantly, this definition talks about schemes, plans, or patterns, and abuse of threatened abuse of the legal process as forms of coercion. And as we talk about the vulnerabilities and some tactics that are used by abusers and traffickers, you'll start to see how what we're seeing with the population that we've met through the HTICs, how their experience does meet the federal legal definition of a severe form of trafficking in persons. And so today we're focusing particularly on the East Asian women that we've met that were working at illicit massage businesses and that were manipulated by their exploiters, abusers, traffickers to subject them to exploitation and human trafficking. And we'll also discuss some ways to respond thoughtfully and meaningfully in light of our understanding of their backgrounds. So as Judge Sarita mentioned, Yvonne and I were with Sanctuary for Families when we were present in the Queens and Brooklyn Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. Oh, I'm sorry, can you switch to the next slide, please? And we were there between 2014 and 2020, and the only reason why our presence in the courts ended was because of COVID, which prevented any of us from showing up. Next slide, please. The clients that we were meeting were predominantly female, though some of them, we did have a handful of male clients, defendants or survivors. Many of them were recent immigrants from Asia and predominantly China, as Judge Sarita mentioned. Most did not speak or had limited English proficiency. They lacked knowledge around US legal systems, including the criminal justice process that they were a part of at the time. And most were defending charges of unlicensed practice of the profession, which was massage at the time, or prostitution. Next slide, please. So we kind of very broadly grouped some of the vulnerabilities here for you all to see. Many of them are Asian women, they're immigrants, massage workers in illicit or legitimate businesses, and they experience their cultural values being exploited. First, we just wanted to mention, in this context, we'll talk about clients. They might show up as clients for service providers on the call. They might show up as a defendant if you're a judge or a prosecutor. But our focus in this court part was primarily on the survivors in this group, and which we would identify after the screening process and the immigration consultation that we offered. And we wanted to provide just a little bit of background about kind of these particular areas of vulnerability. So why we highlight specifically Asian women as a category for being vulnerable is quite a few things. But we won't have enough time to cover the entire history around why Asian women experience a particularly racist form of misogyny and objectification. But just to mention a few, US involvement in wars in Asia generated a particular view of East Asian women in those contexts, in that many were provided to US soldiers as comfort women, or essentially sex workers or prostitutes in those contexts. There was the Page Act, in the late 1800s that specifically targeted Asian women, Chinese women in particular, as a particularly vile form of like a moral problem in society, and prevented East Asian women from coming to the US, and including the Chinese Exclusion Act, which also prevented Chinese people from immigrating to the US. And that would be the first actual piece of immigration legislation that the US had that also specifically targeted a nationality. And we also don't have a ton of time to talk about the media portrayal of Asian women, but certainly we're familiar with stereotypes like the dragon lady or the geisha, or characters from Madame Butterfly that paint a particular picture of how Asian women behave or how they ought to be treated. And ultimately, it is this kind of objectification of Asian women that put them at particular risk in this context. And this all culminated in a particular experience last March, which I will pass over to Yvonne to discuss briefly.
I wanted to highlight all of these different instances because it's important to recognize that people have multiple experiences that happen at the same time. And so these multiple identities are really important to recognize while we're working with populations who may not be at the forefront of mainstream portrayals of media, or also people who need services and different things like that. And a lot of this culminated in terms of this really brutal murders of Atlanta. And there are these people that were killed in the Atlanta massage businesses. And it was a view of everything culminating from the racist and objectification and exoticization of Asian women. It was this othering of people who did not have a lot of support, maybe in terms of resources. It was this assumption that everyone was there providing sexual services when that's not proven to be the case, and we have no full evidence that those specific people were. So it's really this, it's important to highlight because people were so shocked. There were many people who were very shocked by these murders, and a lot of people who've been doing this work have been highlighting, especially in light of COVID, the rise in anti-Asian attacks. And people have been highlighting this, and it finally came to fruition in a sense that people were finally seeing and realizing that these biases and these assumptions can kill people, and they're deadly, and they have real life consequences. And so that's, really what one of the things that we really wanted to highlight is in informing people that these assumptions that people have really matter, even if people feel that they are harmless, and the history and the context of the othering and xenophobia around Asian people also. So really just wanting to highlight a lot of these different vulnerabilities as we see, because they have real impacts on people's lives. And so that's something that we wanted to highlight and recognize because it's such an important part that ideally everyone on this call noticed or heard about that news and were impacted in some way in realizing that people's assumptions and people's racism and people's misogyny and people's multi-layer identities really impact the way that they live their lives, as well as how people view them in who needs assistance or who needs support or who is worthy of services. And so, it's really important to have in this context, as we're going to talk later on also about the courts systems and systems as a whole, and how we can work together in really building this frame and network of assistance should people need them.
We also highlight being an immigrant as a particular vulnerability, because since the 1960s, after quotas around different nationalities were removed, it allowed many more immigrants to enter the US. And so we met a lot of clients who were very recent immigrants, some just within a few months of them arriving, and some who are maybe here for a few more years and in different kinds of immigration processes. But in essence, being recent arrivals and being folks that were new to the customs, norms, and laws in the US, it does put the particular individuals that we met in the court part at a particular disadvantage, in that they had a difficult time navigating the criminal justice system, but also the society outside. And that's also something that put them at particular risk. Yvonne, did you want to say anything about that experience and the court experience as well as an immigrant?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that it is important to recognize that people don't have the context of what is happening. It's important that we think about really recognizing that we should inform people of what their rights are, how the legal system works, these social norms maybe as to who is providing you assistance and information, and what does it mean to have legal counsel? What does it mean to have service providers? And what does it mean for all these different things that may seem intuitive for people who grew up with information about the court system or the legal context or the legal system in the US, or even knowing your rights, is really something that are assumptions. And so to be able to create a space is important for that, because there was so much confusion about who was who, confusion about who they should talk to, what the procedures were. And it was, really important in the court context where we were, in that we had service providers to be able to explain also perhaps what was happening, to have people who were doing proper interpretation and translation of things that were going on, and just ensuring that people were understanding versus being thrown into a space where everything felt very chaotic and very confusing as to know exactly what was supposed to happen. And another thing that we wanted to highlight in terms of a vulnerability is a massage worker who is working in illicit and legitimate businesses. It's really important to highlight that, because oftentimes there's an assumption, you may have heard about these, you may have had them yourself, you may have not really thought about this, but when we talk about Asian-owned massage businesses, a lot of times people assume that there is sexual services being given. And that really is important, because that really puts people at risk for assault. It puts people at risk for multiple violences that happen against them. It's also, for many people, a low-income space. And so it's really easily exploited by people who have power, want to take advantage of those who are lacking things such as money. And really important to recognize that people who work in these spaces as a whole, it doesn't necessarily matter if they are working and providing sexual services or not, but they're being subjected to the same assumptions and also just violence. So it doesn't, if someone was providing sexual services, they can still be taken advantage of in these spaces. If someone was not, they can still be taken advantage of in these spaces. And so that's just something we wanted to highlight as a recognition that assumptions and people who are living in poverty have a really vulnerable to these exploitation of systems that are against them. And then we also wanted to highlight cultural values that are exploited by traffickers and abusers. And I want to be careful about the language, because we hear a lot about how this is people's culture and the culture is the one that's exploiting people, or the assumption that it's just happening the way it is because it's in someone's culture. We want to be very clear that exploiters are exploiting the cultural values that people have in these communities. And it's really important to acknowledge that, because it is not that the cultural values are exploiting people, it's traffickers who are exploiting these cultural values. So there's a very clear distinction that we want to make, because otherwise we could be unintentionally reiterating this idea that specific cultures are exploitative as a whole. Next slide, please. So we wanted to highlight this as vulnerabilities because a lot of those vulnerabilities traffickers exploit, and the cultural values are also exploited, and exploiters and traffickers really use these multitude of identities to coerce people into commercial sex and or labor as well, labor trafficking or labor exploitation. So for example, we're talking about financial vulnerability, poverty, if there's debt, if they are taking care of others financially. There's a lot of immigrant circumstances that include being undocumented and very fearful of returning to their home country. If there are arrests that happen, what does that mean for their application that is currently being processed to apply for status or apply for documentation? Really important things. Lack of understanding of legal systems and social customs. We talk about a lot for those of us who have worked in court parts or are still in the courts. We recognize that there's also unscrupulous attorneys and non-attorneys who take advantage of people as a whole, take advantage of people's lack of understanding and lack of information. So I see some different things. It's the same for those of you who are having technical difficulties on viewing the slides. It's the same slide as before, but with a mark of coercion labeled over it. And we'll be working on that as well for the slides. And then being Asian and female, an objectified commodity that abusers, buyers, and traffickers exploit is something to recognize, as well as I mentioned before, which we'll go into now more, cultural values that are exploited by traffickers. Next slide, please.
So we'll unpack cultural values a little bit more in how they impact our engagement with clients and their experience of the court part and the services that are being offered. Next slide.
So two things that we want to mention and highlight. This is, of course, again, not all Asian cultures and the Asian diaspora, because we recognize that Asia is a very large continent, over 45 countries, over 2,000 languages spoken. And we really want to think about cultural values, and 面子 is really important. Direct translation would be something with face or saving face. And it's avoiding disgrace and keeping up these appearances, keeping up this notion that everything is fine, helping rescue others from embarrassing situations. So people feel that they should be helping others in any sort of situation because they want to keep up the appearance that everything is fine, even if they themselves are not doing well. Losing face, it's really thinking about humiliation. It's a loss of reputation. It really negatively impacts your social circle. I think for people who may not understand or come from these backgrounds that have some of these similar cultural values, is it can really impact all aspects of your life. And so I've heard a lot of conversation from people who have questions around, well, if you just, can it be something that we can just unlearn very quickly? And we can't. These are things that have been ingrained in a lot of people. And so in the saving face, it's really shameful to have an arrest, for people, there's a negative stigma on people thinking that you are engaging in prostitution or providing sexual services. These are different things, from arrest to not being able to take care of your family, not being able to, I encountered a lot of clients who were in so much debt and didn't have money for themselves, and yet were they don't see it as a burden, they see it as a responsibility to send money back home to take care of people. So these are kind of these different things that really get impacted. And that's how a lot of abusers also are taking advantage of these cultural values that people feel and are take really to heart and are really just really in their DNA, I would say. We also think about filial piety and duties. So there's definitely a greater concern for family needs and social reputation. I often call a lot of the clients that I worked with caretakers. They're caretakers of their family and their community, and they're often, if not most of the time, thinking about other people, and they're thinking about their community and their loved ones. There's a lesser concern for personal sufferings and individual needs. And so that's really thinking about what does it mean to always imagine that every decision you make has an impact on others? What does it mean for every service that you want or that you need, and your acceptance of a social service, for example, how does that impact other people in the community? You know, we worked on financial assistance for a lot of people, but oftentimes they would reject it because they felt like there was 100% someone else who was worthy of this assistance more than they were, or there was always someone else who could benefit it more from what they were. And that's not to say that they weren't experiencing their own their own needs. And so that's something to put into context really importantly, because traffickers know that, and who are traffickers are from the community, they know that, and they will use that to exploit people and to traffic people. So that's a really important mindset to keep in mind when working with this specific community. I'm going to next slide, please. So another thing is really being capable of enduring hardship without complaint. It really is for the benefit, if for the benefit of loved ones, there's no complaint. As I mentioned earlier, it's not a burden, it's really a responsibility that are doing.
You want to jump in?
Yes, sure. So while Yvonne maybe reconnects, I'll jump in here for a second. So in terms of additional cultural values, enduring hardship, as Yvonne mentioned, is something that's highly regarded. Being able to endure difficult situations, which many of the people we've met encountered once they came to the US, that would be considered a virtue. I see Yvonne's image is back. Give me a thumbs up if you want to take this back.
Sorry about that, everyone. Technical difficulties, which have not centered themselves. But yeah, so really thinking about a lot of this. Traditional Chinese culture is reserved about sex, which I know Amy had mentioned, but really just thinking about how exploiters and traffickers use this. We really just want to highlight the notion that traffickers are really targeting this and exploiters are targeting this. And people in the community, as well as just people as a whole, if there are vulnerabilities, oftentimes people will take advantage of that. So next slide, please.
So in addition to the cultural background, there's also a difference in legal context and social context. So just using our Chinese clients as an example, they are coming from a different form of government where the legal systems and the rights they have as individuals are different. And so, for example, being able to put forward evidence of their victimization is much more important than their own testimony. And so a lot of times our clients will say, well, but I didn't get that person's, I don't have a picture of the person, or I don't have any other physical evidence. And we're like, but it's fine. Like, your testimonial evidence is just as important. And they kind of have a harder time understanding that, and kind of just trusting what we're offering them in terms of legal advice. Additionally, they're coming from a background where it's not so much about partnering with service providers and lawyers, and maybe even using media strategy to help advocate for their situation. And so something like the HTIC would be very foreign. And I think maybe the HTIC as a model is maybe still foreign to some other parts of the US, but being someone who's coming through this legal process that is partnering with providers and defense attorneys and prosecutors and the judge is something very foreign. And so it does take a bit for us to be able to explain to the folks in front of us to help get their own buy-in in this legal process, and to see that the services that they're being offered is for their benefit and is not meant to be a coercive thing in itself. I also highlight the coercive population control policy, which has now been changed in China. But previously, a lot of our clients did experience forced abortions, or they themselves were only children, or have experienced some form of trauma as a result of that policy. That also made them very wary of help from others and from folks that seem to be any bit affiliated with the government. Another kind of context is how domestic violence is or had been normalized in China. And up until 2015, there wasn't a particular law that really sought to protect domestic violence survivors. And I'm not quite sure how it's now playing out in China, but the law is rather recent. And so I think the view of survivors of gender-based violence is also new. And so a lot of our clients that we had met were fleeing some form of domestic violence and having experienced some other form of gender violence here in the work context. I think there's just another layer of trauma that we're also trying to work through. When we talk about trafficking and sex trafficking in particular, they have a harder time seeing themselves as a trafficking survivor, because in their kind of view of who is a trafficked person, they're thinking about Southeast Asian women who have been trafficked into China, for example, or trafficking of male children. And maybe even here in the US, when we talk about trafficking, we're frequently putting together some kind of image that doesn't fit the legal definition that we just talked about earlier. And so maybe, the common example is like the Liam Neeson movie with Taken, where an individual is kidnapped and stuff like that. And that's not what's happening for the folks that we're meeting through the HTIC. And so they have a hard time seeing themselves as potential survivors of this form of violence and crime. And then lastly, mental health care is something that's pretty heavily stigmatized in East Asia and in China in particular. And so seeking mental health support is something that people don't like to admit that they need. They see it as an inconvenience, or that it reflects badly upon their own families. And oftentimes I see it as a weapon. Sometimes involuntary commitment is used as a weapon in domestic violence situations. And it essentially seeking that kind of help is not something that folks readily admit. There's also a lack of familiarity around US legal concepts. So for example, confidentiality is something that they see with a very skeptical eye. And because we're Asian, because we speak Mandarin, they have this fear that we will share their information with others in the community, and that there's no way that we're actually going to keep this information to ourselves. But as a lawyer, we're bound by attorney-client privilege and to respect the confidences of our clients unless it is to their legal advantage, right? So that is something that we also have to take the time to explain to our clients. Next slide, please. So we talk about all of these cultural values and context because we know that traffickers have frequently used these bits of information and their own understanding of where our clients are coming from to exploit our clients. So for example, they tell them not to trust service providers, especially free service providers, which the services we were offering at the HTICs were free. And as I mentioned, we have.
I wanted to add too about the service providers piece. I think it's another assumption that people understand how nonprofits and non-governmental organizations work, whereas the context is very different from a lot of the people that we met who are from China. And so the understanding and even explaining what that means is really important. And so again, wanting to highlight that assumptions, we don't want to make any. And so it's important just to be able to explain these different things that you assume or that I assumed people may know, but in fact they do not. And so that's just something that we also tended to do to explain who we were and what we were doing there and what does it mean to have a nonprofit and what does it mean to not work for the government, and if they were concerned about things getting back to communities or things getting reported back to governments.
And related to
Amy, you're muted.
Related, oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Related to the false information that exploiters provide, there's also a warning for them to not come into contact with legal systems because many will have overstayed their tourist visa or will have no visa or immigration status in the US. And so the threats of deportation come into play. And so not reporting crimes that were committed against them is something that frequently happens. Warning them about not going outside the doors of the business that they're working at is also a common theme that we hear about. And we also hear about our clients frequently having been referred to immigration attorneys that are filing applications for them. More of the times it's asylum applications, which they may or may not be eligible for, but frequently the clients that we met have not been fully explained what that form of immigration relief is and what the legal requirements are. And so we find that clients are actually put at greater risk by filing these applications and being coerced to do so by their traffickers and exploiters. Sometimes also creating a new form of indebtedness that subjects them to the control of exploiters.
There's also, this impact of exploitation that we talked about in terms of these impacted communities. So really understanding that oftentimes people are taken advantage of from multiple areas. And whether that be from an undocumented person to not knowing English as your first language or native tongue, to not exactly knowing what rights people do have, and in this context, in the US context. So a lot of people are fearful and distrustful of what services look like, who is actually there for them, because a lot of people also have been misled and exploited and lied to in the past. They may not be able to disclose their full story until you have an established relationship of trust with a service provider. I will note that trust takes time. So for people who wanted maybe perhaps a very streamlined way in terms of gaining trust for this community, it just takes time. And I equate that to similar if someone tells me I should trust them, or if I'm telling someone they should trust me, but they don't know me, why should I expect them to trust me, right? They have no qualifications of who I am. People say things all the time. It would be presumptuous of me to expect my saying that they should trust me, that they can trust me. So really, I think putting egos aside and really having that understanding that, yeah, just because I say people can trust me doesn't mean they should. And it's really important that we have all these different layers that we're considering and giving people information about so that we can build that trust. Next slide, please.
So we're just flagging here that it isn't so much that we are interested in getting in with this community, but I think importantly for those who want to be able to connect with this particular group of survivors, it's about earning their trust. And so we're going to spend a few minutes just talking through a couple of different ways that we've worked that out over the years. Next slide, please. And also to say that this is not comprehensive and, you know, it's not like the ultimate cheat sheet. It can definitely be something that you continue to figure out as you spend time with this community. So Yvonne, I'll hand it back to you.
So we wanted to really think about what cultural sensitivity means and what does trauma-informed mean. As we know, a lot of these words can be thrown around a lot without context and without understanding what that can look like also practically in case management and legal services, which I know that a lot of people had put in the chat where they were coming from. So it's good to see advocates as well as judges, as well as government people who are in this space to listen. But one of the things that we think about is really being self-aware about our own background and belief system. What does it mean that I'm coming from a different space and a different understanding of the world than the people that I'm meeting? Culture impacts one's view, and that can look in a multitude of different ways. Really thinking about that, really anticipating client needs to ensure that there's comfort during a meeting. So for example, a lot of clients don't like to burden people or be of inconvenience. And so sometimes when asking if people want services or if they would like us to bring them something to eat or get some water, they may reject at first. But it's not necessarily because they don't want to, it's because they feel that they are potentially being a burden upon someone else. I mentioned earlier about people being able to seek services and making sure that if I was giving financial assistance, I had to frame it differently because people also always said that someone else deserved it more than they did. So just really thinking about these things, being really transparent in regarding the role and reasons for asking certain questions. It's really important that we do not ask questions solely for the fact of voyeurism. We want to ensure that we have a purpose and we want to state what that purpose is. Immigration attorneys in the immigration consultations we did were invasive and they're really personal questions. And so it's important to even provide context as to why you're asking these questions and what the end goal is. A lot of the clients that we worked with were very practically minded in terms of what would me sharing my information result in? What does it mean to apply for something? What does it mean in the long run to accept services and to receive things? What does it mean that I have these rights if I have not seen them played out in different ways realistically? So these are just some of the things that we want to be mindful of, and we want to make sure that we're not having our biases really unintentionally impact the way that we treat people. So again, assuming that people want to be in specific situations unless they tell us, you know, we really want to respect people's decisions and what they're saying to us. And we want to respect that if they're saying X, Y, and Z, then we should believe X, Y, and Z, with the understanding also that we're making it possible so people can really share truthfully about their experiences as well.
And
next
I just
slide. Oh yeah.
Yeah, next slide. But I would just add, as we're switching over to the next slide, that a key piece here, which we didn't include in the slide, is just the sense of safety. So if you take the view that the folks you're encountering are some form of trauma survivor, gender-based violence survivor, trafficking survivor, you know that safety has been taken away from them. And so part of just explaining what we're doing with asking these questions is giving back a little piece of psychological safety, also in kind of containing what we're talking about. So we just also highlight here how this plays out in case management and legal services. So providing accurate information is another really important piece. They have been provided a lot of information as newcomers from the folks that are exploiting them. And it's hard to tell if we're also exploiting them, right? And offering them misinformation. But I think taking that time and opportunity to debunk any misinformation, and particularly around asylum claims, we've found to be a really important way to connect with the survivors in this context. Also, demonstrating familiarity with trafficking issues was very helpful. So explaining to our clients that what they experienced is not unique to themselves, and that they were somehow to blame, or like it's just them that has experienced this particular situation, but that we've encountered many clients who have been defrauded or coerced in the same way. Also helped them to gain their trust, helped us to gain their trust, and help them to see that we do have experience with this particular challenge. And when interviewing clients, we try to mirror their language, use the euphemisms that they used, and that helped them to understand that also we've been exposed to a lot of other folks with the same experience. And most importantly, treating clients with dignity, respect, and cultural sensitivity. And by that, we just mean treating them like you would someone you know personally sitting across from you who had experienced something similar. Next slide, please. We highlight building trust for the clients and their needs holistically, because I think any one profession probably cannot meet the needs, the myriad of needs that many of the survivors we meet need. And so for that, we do rely on being able to work with other partner organizations. And so I think I saw in the chat that Leslie had shared information that connects them to other service providers in other contexts. But being able to build that wraparound network is super important when, as a lone service provider, you might not be able to. When we use these we can use these meetings as an opportunity to first connect them with some essential social services, such as English as second language programs, healthcare if they need it, other self-sufficiency resources, regardless of whether these individuals disclose their trafficking experience or not, and using those opportunities to learn their story more, and again, demonstrate that we are treating them as people worthy of dignity and respect. And all of these services help to build trust for the clients and help us to have future opportunities to then discuss their experience. Next slide, please. Oh yeah.
Wanted to add, we really want to think about it as a lot of the clients had told us that they didn't know what was for them, who was for them, what information was there. And so it really is about providing access to these resources and this information that a lot of other communities may have. And if people do not have access to those, it's really informing them that they also have certain rights and they also have this information. Because what we don't want to do is tell people what they need. What we can do is give all the plethora of information so that they're able to assess options in a way that isn't coercive, because a lot of times they were coerced into these different spaces, such as agreeing to the work at a space where they were told would provide X amount of wages, different things like that, or that they would not provide sexual services, or that they would provide sexual services, but only a certain type of sexual services. So it's really one of these things that we think about in terms of ensuring that people are aware of everything that is going on, so that they are able to make their informed decisions and empowered decisions based off of the full range of options. And so really thinking about that is how we can really build trust for these communities and for people who, if they were ever to, are able to reach out should they want to. Next slide.
We just have the slide here just to note that we're so grateful for all of the attendees that are joining today and that will be listening in later, because we do really believe that supporting Asian survivors of exploitation and trafficking is social justice and racial and gender equity work, which I think that's where we're all striving for in our respective organizations. Next slide. So we wanted to talk briefly about what's something easily achievable now in your own roles and organizations. Importantly, I think expanding our own views and our assumptions to work around working with this population is super important. And to Yvonne's point earlier, just kind of reflecting about our own backgrounds and what we bring to the table. Just because we have the language skills doesn't mean that we completely identify or can kind of empathize with what our clients are experiencing. And so there is a bit of self-reflection that happens with, or that it needs to happen as we engage with this population. I think also treating people humanely is both a very simple statement and probably very difficult to do. Folks are certainly a lot more than the experience of exploitation or trafficking that may have brought them to encounter you or the court part. And they are certainly a lot more than the particular instance, such as their arrest for prostitution that may bring them into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I think we just want to highlight that these are people. Even though we're meeting them in a specific context, they have other things going on in their lives. So really putting aside what my assumptions of what people are experiencing, but what they're telling me they're experiencing, understanding that they're not sharing everything they're experiencing, because again, just because I say they can trust me doesn't mean that they need to trust me until at some point I've proven myself, right? And really thinking about that, the people that we worked with really enjoyed being on social media to talk to their family members because they were so far away from their families, who liked to really engage in touristy things in New York City, or who liked to eat what food. These are some conversations that I would have when I was encountering people, because again, they're full humans with a varied different of experiences, and that's what we want to really ensure that people remember as well. It's really important also just to understand a person's circumstances and context. What is happening in their lives? And this is not to say we should be voyeuristic and asking questions about all of the things that happened to them and everything that's going on now, because unless that's really necessary for their services that they're seeking, but it is just a framework for us and how we operate. So, we want to avoid using punitive measures as well to persuade change for this community. Next slide.
So I think the key piece to how we can build up our efforts in serving this community is the investment in time and intention, I think, in serving this community. So, and when we say this community, and as I think Judge Sarita pointed out earlier, this whole moniker of Asian women or Asians in general is very broad and encompasses a lot of different groups of people. And so Yvonne and I think at least in our time at Sanctuary, spent a lot of time with East Asian survivors, but also some Southeast Asian survivors, very few South Asian survivors, I would say, but it's still a handful. And I know that there are plenty of participants on this webinar that have expertise in kind of these different groups. And so we don't mean to say it kind of, Asians are not a monolithic group, but in essence, to work with this community, it does take time to connect with the folks that are already doing the work, but then also taking the time to be intentional to understand the complexities around gender-based survivors in these communities, and also taking the time to build trust with them. That includes creating meaningful opportunities for them to engage in like both advocacy efforts, but also to employment efforts. And then it also takes a huge investment of time and funds to create sustainable programs. And so I think that is something that we want to implore folks who are seeking to expand their services to really think about, because it is great to want to serve more folks, but at the same time, you have to understand that once you're stepping a toe into it, you kind of need to be there for a very long time for it to make a real impact. And so I think with that, Yvonne and I will stop after going way over time and hand it back to Judge Sarita for any questions.
For a second. Amy and Yvonne, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I know that over the years, all of you, including several different organizations working with East Asian trafficking survivors, have engaged in community and educational efforts to really create awareness around these issues. And I think that this is an ongoing effort, right, that will not stop. Because as many times as you do these, trainings around trafficking or cultural awareness, there's still more groups that really need this information. So I thank you very much for spending the time to talk about this today. One of the questions that I had, and I wanted to know if you two could talk about this a little bit. The title of this seminar was, Women Caught in the Crosshairs of Exploitation and Human Trafficking. I think that one of the challenges for people dealing with Asian trafficking survivors is just how difficult it is, right? Sometimes to understand the dynamics of trafficking, let's say in a, massage parlor context, because you don't see the usual indicia of violence or force, or, it manifests itself in very different ways. So I want to know if you could talk about that a little bit, and also just how, even let's say with an individual who's working in a massage parlor, that the line between coercion and exploitation and actual trafficking can be very varied, right? What is choice in that situation, right? Especially if choice is a lot of times motivated by, desperation or poverty. That's what we see a lot, right, in the defendants who appear in the trafficking intervention court as well. So I know I threw a lot of things at you, but whatever you want to respond to.
So I think first, it's really important to recognize, kind of all of these different things that you had stated, because I think oftentimes we're presented with a person and just their one aspect of, what they need, or maybe specifically only what they shared in the first time around. It really, I've heard a lot of very varying responses to identifying exploitation and trafficking within this community. One of the things that people do recognize is that there is a lot of violence, actually. The violence is not typically coming from traffickers in this context, but a lot of times from customers who are coming in and assuming sexual services. Again, we obviously have went over it in time because there's a lot to talk about. But really thinking about, even if someone said they were going to be providing only a certain type of sexual services, people can assume that a lot of Asian women are going to perform all these different types because of an assumption of exoticization, and that people in this culture, I've heard these words before, specifically want to do these sexual services. And that's something that they were taught in their culture, which is plainly very racist because that's not something that is told or said specifically. So, you know, I think that's really important. And I think in the context of this conversation is people need to understand that there are vulnerabilities that exist and everyone has vulnerabilities. But with these specific targets, we had later multiple coercion vulnerabilities that exploiters use to coerce people into making these choices, into these decisions where from an outside view, people would say, well, they made their own choice. They made their own bed. They decided to do this, and therefore they are responsible for the actions and the exploitation, for example, that were taken against them and performed on them. But why should that be the case? And, you know, our goal is to really provide information for people and awareness for people so that people are able to know their rights and to make specific conversations and decisions with the full range of options. And I think that fits into this context of what we're talking about in social justice. And what does it mean if people don't have equal access to information or equal footing on where I can even ask for help? Because if I'm undocumented and I'm currently applying for legal status, but still considered undocumented, what does it mean if I don't feel like I can ask someone for assistance? So I think there's like multiple different things. And I know Amy wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I think I wanted to pick up on the part of the question about, well, didn't these women choose this particular situation? And I just wanted to reflect back on at least the international definition of trafficking in persons, where it talks about how consent is irrelevant. And the reason why we spent so much time talking about these vulnerabilities and coercion is that, at least in the US context, we're really talking about how these vulnerabilities were then used in a scheme, plan, or pattern to coerce a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act or labor. And there's, you know, different definitions of like involuntary servitude, peonage, all of that. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if the person chose to work in this space or that the person chose to say provide manual stimulation, but not sexual intercourse or something like that. The point is that the person is being coerced by someone else, a third party, to perform a commercial sex act. And that makes that person a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. And so legally speaking, the consent factor is not entirely relevant to identifying whether someone meets the legal definition or not. And I think if you kind of take that step back and look at that big picture of when someone is put in a situation where the best option for themselves is to either knowingly or unknowingly begin work at an illicit massage place, is that even really a choice at all? And so ultimately, I think that is not the most important question, but more importantly, kind of what has then been the person's experience to then have them end up in this particular situation, maybe in a criminal court part, maybe just kind of encountering them in street outreach or something like that. But it's sort of taking that humanistic view at treating the person as an individual and kind of asking the questions about, like, what is that big picture for this person?
So I have a couple of questions in the chat that I want to direct to all of you, because I think together, I think they highlight a little bit more, give you an opportunity to talk about the work you three have done together. Mm-hmm. The first question has to do, somebody wanted to understand, Judge Sarita, a little bit more about the question they wanted to confirm is that people came into court with charges, and then it sounds like they were offered services and interviewed. Maybe you guys could explain a little bit more about how that worked. You know, and then the next question is kind of related, and I know, Judge Sarita, this is something you're interested in as well, is when the victims haven't come yet to the judicial system, how do they get connected with services? So I'll turn it over to all of you on those two questions.
Sure. Until about 2 or 3 years ago, we would see, I don't know, an average of 500 defendants coming into the Queens Trafficking Intervention for a year. And they would be arrested on prostitution charges and also for unlicensed massage, working in massage parlors. What we would do is we had no requirement that anybody be identified as a victim of trafficking, and in fact, did not find out about that until after their cases were closed in many instances. But we would offer services to everybody who came into the court based on a recognition that there may be either victims of trafficking or they are, in exploitative situations, right? Working in commercial sex. And so based on participation with a service provider, 5 sessions usually, maybe a little bit more, they would come back, show proof, and have their cases ultimately dismissed. And one of the things that we were doing in Queens at one point is directing all of the foreign national defendants to be interviewed by Sanctuary for Families as part of their pro bono project, because we knew that there were so many different reasons why an initial disclosure might not be made, that this was something that you could not do just on, a sheet of paper, asking the person like 10, 15 questions. And so, that is what I thought was very, very effective, that you had Mandarin speaking interpreters, counselors, lawyers, right, working very intensively with these individuals. In terms of the other question, right, as far as what is being done outside of the justice system, the one thing I want to say was that even though we had hundreds of cases, the NYPD established a different policy where they finally recognized that the individuals, the women that they were arresting, were in fact, being victimized, right, in the sex trade, and they have stopped arresting people on prostitution and unlicensed massage. And so now the Trafficking Intervention Corps has decreased significantly in terms of its participants. I don't know if Amy and Yvonne want to chime in.
Yeah, I think one thing, 2 quick things, because I know we're running out of time, is one of the things is when people are arrested, I would say that they're also arrested for different things. There's a multitude of range on what people are arrested for. And, I would highlight the Legal Aid Society's Exploitation Intervention Project, because they recognize that people were also being arrested for other crimes. And that's something to take note of, because it doesn't necessarily mean that people are only arrested for prostitution or with massage without a license. I will say in specific states, it's very difficult to get a massage license, and a lot of people were not knowing what the full information was and taken advantage of and scammed in that way, which was another layer of vulnerability that was added to taking advantage of people not knowing their information. In terms of outreach and really connecting with potential victims and people who are in this community, it takes time. Please definitely feel free to contact us about trainings, because being able to do outreach was really important for me. Specifically, I did a lot of street outreach as well as outreach within the courts. And I think it really helped build a better gauge of understanding on this population and working with this community and humanizing, I think, this community in a lot of ways. So just really important to highlight that in terms of how people can interact with them and how people, again, what we don't want is these quote unquote rescue missions that end up shutting a lot of Asian-owned massage businesses down solely for the fact based on assumptions. I think about this a lot in training and awareness at ECPAT USA. Like, we do a lot of advocacy and awareness because I've seen so much being in direct service, how important it is to really bring awareness and education and giving people the information to their rights, and understanding that the context is also people may have rights, but they're not able to access them because our systems sometimes are not working for them and they're not built for them. And so really just understanding that this larger context of it's complicated, and we are here to help people through that nuance and those complexities. Amy?
And I think the question is, I guess all the questions were interesting. For me, it helped me to think about how all the different roles work together to serve this community, because certainly we're not law enforcement. Judge Sarita is in her role as a judge. We're service providers, and I think any one alone or one group like kind of trying to find trafficking survivors alone will not be able to effectively reach this community. And so I think to Yvonne's point about also connecting with them and offering services that they need, and not necessarily services that we think they need, but using the points that help, that they can identify for themselves to serve as a starting point to then start the conversation about kind of what it is that they broadly need. But also that also goes back to the broader point of, if you want to serve this community, it really does take a broader investment of time and funds to make sure that any kind of program like this is sustainable. So I think just to keep all that in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are nearing the end of our presentation time for today. So I really want to express my appreciation to NJA and National Judicial Network, as well as to the speakers today for a very, very illuminating presentation. I don't know if Professor Orloff wants to say anything in closing.
I would just like to thank the speakers and thank all of you for attending, your interest in the topic, and the work that you're doing with survivors in the field. It's super important. Please fill out the evaluations, which we'll be sending you right after the close of this webinar, and we will be following up with links to materials and presentation information. And some of the things we put in the chat we'll also make sure are in the materials we send you. So thank you all for the work you do on behalf of trafficking survivors, and for joining us today.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ella, are we back on our